The dust-choked air of Sweetwater Creek seemed to carry whispers of tragedy as Violet Lawson stepped into the crowded barn social, her black morning dress standing out starkly among the colorful calico and denim of the other attendees. It had been exactly 1 year since her husband had been laid to rest, and this was her first social gathering since that dark day in the spring of 1875. The barn had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm, golden glow over the hay-strewn floor where couples twirled to the lively tune of fiddles and harmonicas. Children darted between the legs of adults, their laughter nearly drowned out by the music and chatter. The scent of fresh-baked pies and strong coffee mingled with the earthier smells of horses and hay. Violet stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her small beaded purse with white-knuckled fingers. At 26, she was still young, but the past year had aged her in ways time alone could not. Her once vibrant auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her green eyes, once described by her late husband as sparkling like emeralds, now seemed dull and unfocused. Violet Lawson, as I live and breathe, Mrs. Abernathy, the postmaster's wife, rushed over with outstretched arms. It's so good to see you out and about again, dear. We've all been so worried. Violet managed a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. I thought it was time. Well, of course it is. Robert would want you to live, dear. Oh. The older woman's eyes widened as she spotted someone across the room. There's Sheriff Miller. I simply must ask him about those chicken thieves. Excuse me, dear. Left alone once more, Violet took a deep breath and moved toward the refreshment table. Perhaps some punch would settle her nerves. The crowd parted and shifted as she walked, and she couldn't help but notice the whispers and sympathetic glances that followed her. In a town as small as Sweetwater Creek, everyone knew everyone's business, and her tragedy had been the talk of the town for months. Look who's finally emerged from hibernation, a sharp voice cut through the general din. Violet turned to see Eleanor Pritchard, the banker's daughter, eyeing her critically. Black doesn't suit you, Violet. It washes out your complexion something terrible. Eleanor, Violet acknowledged with a stiff nod. How are you? Better than you, clearly, Eleanor replied with a smirk. Though I suppose widowhood has its advantages. All that sympathy, all those casseroles, and now you're free to set your cap for someone new. Her gaze drifted meaningfully toward the far side of the barn. Perhaps someone like the new ranch hand at the Triple R. They say he's quite the catch. Violet followed Eleanor's gaze to a tall man leaning against a post, deep in conversation with some of the local ranchers. Even from this distance, she could see he was handsome, with broad shoulders and an easy stance that spoke of confidence without arrogance. I have no interest in setting my cap for anyone, Violet said firmly, turning back to Eleanor. If you'll excuse me. She made her way to the punch bowl, hands trembling slightly as she ladled the ruby liquid into a cup. The noise of the social seemed to grow louder with each passing moment, pressing in on her from all sides. The fiddles screeched, boots stomped, and laughter rose to a cacophony that made her head spin. The memories came flooding back, Robert twirling her around the floor at the last social they'd attended together, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled down at her. Robert's hand, steady and strong, holding hers as they walked home under the stars. Robert's voice, growing weaker by the day as the fever took hold, until finally it fell silent forever. Violet felt the blood drain from her face. The cup slipped from her fingers, splashing punch across the hem of her dress, but she barely noticed. The room began to tilt and sway around her, faces blurring into unrecognizable shapes. Her chest tightened painfully, making it impossible to draw a full breath. Madam? Are you all right? A deep voice cut through the fog of her panic, but it seemed to come from very far away. Violet tried to respond, but no words came. The edges of her vision began to darken, and she swayed on her feet. Strong hands caught her by the elbows, steadying her. You need some air, the voice said, closer now. Through the haze, Violet became aware of being guided through the crowd. People parted before them, their curious faces swimming in and out of focus. And then, mercifully, they were outside. The cool night air hit her face like a splash of water, clearing some of the fog from her mind. She gulped it in desperately, her hands clutching at the rough wooden railing of the barn's small porch. That's it. Just breathe. The voice was gentle, with a slight drawl that marked its owner as not being from Colorado originally. As her vision cleared, Violet found herself looking up into the concerned face of the man Eleanor had pointed out the new ranch hand from the Triple R. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a warm hazel, flecked with gold in the light spilling from the barn's open door. His face was tanned from long days under the sun, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. A day's worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw, and his dark hair curled slightly where it escaped from beneath his hat. "I'm sorry," Violet managed, embarrassment flooding her as she realized what had happened. "I don't know what came over me." "No need to apologize, madam," he said, releasing her elbows but staying close enough to catch her if she swayed again. "Happens to the best of us. Crowds can be overwhelming." Violet nodded, grateful for his understanding. "It's my first social since—" She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "I know," he said simply. "Name's Nathan Yates, by the way. New hand at the Triple R." "Violet Lawson," she replied automatically, though she suspected he already knew who she was. "Miss Violet," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "Would you like me to fetch you some water? Or perhaps escort you home?" "No," she said quickly, not wanting to cause any more of a scene than she already had. "No, thank you. I just need a moment." Nathan nodded, leaning back against the railing beside her, giving her space while still remaining close enough to be a comforting presence. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the muffled sounds of merriment from inside the barn. "I lost my brother 2 years back," Nathan said suddenly, his voice quiet. "Cavalry. Sue got him near the Black Hills. For months after, I couldn't be in a crowd without feeling like I was suffocating." Violet turned to look at him, surprised by the personal revelation from a man she'd just met. "Does it get easier?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan looked out at the darkness for a long moment before answering. "Not easier, exactly. Different. The pain changes shape, becomes something you can carry without it crushing you quite so much." He turned to meet her gaze. "I still miss him every day, but I can remember the good now, not just the loss." There was something about his straightforward honesty that touched Violet deeply. This wasn't the rehearsed sympathy she'd heard from so many others, the empty platitudes that were meant to comfort but only served to isolate her further in her grief. "Thank you," she said, "for the honesty and for—" She gestured vaguely at the barn behind them. "Anytime, Miss Violet." A small smile curved his lips, and in the dim light, she caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before his own loss, light-hearted, perhaps even mischievous. They fell into a comfortable silence again, and Violet found her breathing had returned to normal. The night air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of spring blooms and distant pine. "Beautiful night," Nathan commented, looking up at the stars that blanketed the sky above them. "Don't think I'll ever get used to how many stars you can see out here." "Where are you from originally, Mr. Yates?" Violet asked, curious about this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "Texas, originally. Then all over, I suppose. Drove cattle up from San Antonio to Abilene more times than I can count. Worked ranches in the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming." He shrugged. "Never stayed in one place too long." "Until now?" Violet found herself asking. Nathan's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. A current of understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Maybe," he said softly. "Sweetwater Creek seems like a good place to put down roots." The barn door opened, spilling more light onto the porch and breaking the moment. Eleanor Pritchard stood framed in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene before her. "Violet, darling, are you unwell?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Everyone's wondering where you disappeared to." Violet straightened, suddenly aware of how long she'd been outside with Nathan. What would people think? "I just needed some air. Mr. Yates was kind enough to assist me." "How gallant," Eleanor purred, her gaze raking over Nathan appreciatively. "But the dancing's about to start, and I'm sure Mr. Yates promised a dance to someone inside." Her implication was clear: someone other than a grieving widow in black. To Violet's surprise, Nathan didn't take the bait. "Actually, I haven't promised anyone a dance yet," he said, his tone polite but cool. "Miss Violet, would you care to join me inside? Only if you're feeling up to it, of course." Eleanor's mouth tightened into a thin line. Violet hesitated, torn between the desire to retreat to the safety of her home and the unexpected warmth that Nathan's presence had kindled within her. "Perhaps just one dance," she said finally, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Though I'm afraid I'm out of practice." Nathan's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I'll lead," he promised, offering his arm. As they walked past Eleanor, whose face had flushed an unbecoming shade of red, Violet felt a small, rebellious thrill. For the first time in a year, she was doing something purely because it gave her pleasure, not because it was expected or proper. Inside, the musicians were tuning up for a waltz. Couples were forming on the dance floor, the women's skirts creating a kaleidoscope of color against the straw-strewn floor. Violet was acutely aware of the stares and whispers as Nathan led her to the edge of the floor, but she kept her chin up, focusing on the solid warmth of his arm beneath her hand. "Are you sure about this?" Nathan asked quietly, giving her one last chance to change her mind. Violet took a deep breath. "Yes," she said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. The music began, a sweet lilting waltz that filled the barn with its gentle melody. Nathan placed one hand at the small of her back, took her other hand in his, and then they were moving, gliding across the floor with a grace that belied their brief acquaintance. "You're a good dancer, Mr. Yates," Violet remarked, finding that the steps came back to her more easily than she'd expected. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he replied with a small grin. "Said no son of hers was going to stomp around like a bull in a china shop." The mental image made Violet smile, and the expression felt foreign on her face, as if she'd forgotten how to use those muscles. Nathan's eyes widened slightly at the sight, and his grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. They danced in silence for a while, moving together as if they'd been partners for years rather than minutes. Violet found herself relaxing into the rhythm, the panic of earlier receding with each turn around the floor. The other dancers became a blur of color and movement. All she could see clearly was Nathan's face, his eyes never leaving hers. When the music finally ended, Violet felt almost disappointed. She'd expected to feel guilty for enjoying herself, for smiling, for dancing with a man who wasn't Robert. Instead, she felt lighter somehow, as if a small portion of the weight she'd been carrying had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she said as they moved off the dance floor. "Nathan, please," he replied, "and it was my pleasure, Miss Violet." The evening continued, and to Violet's surprise, she found herself enjoying it. Nathan stayed by her side, not in a possessive way, but as a buffer between her and the well-meaning but often overwhelming sympathy of the townsfolk. He fetched her punch, introduced her to some of the other hands from the Triple R, and even coaxed another smile from her with a story about his first attempt at breaking a particularly stubborn bronco. As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin. Families with young children left first, followed by the older folks who claimed their bones couldn't take the late hours anymore. The music grew quieter, more intimate, and the remaining dancers moved closer together. "It's getting late," Violet said reluctantly, realizing she should probably head home. "I should go." "May I walk you home?" Nathan asked, reaching for his hat, which he'd hung on a peg near the door. Violet hesitated. She lived alone in the small house she'd shared with Robert on the edge of town. Allowing Nathan to escort her there would surely set tongues wagging even more than they already were. As if sensing her thoughts, Nathan added, "Just to your door, Miss Violet. It's not right for a lady to walk alone at night, even in a town as peaceful as Sweetwater Creek." His concern seemed genuine, and Violet found herself nodding. "Thank you, that would be kind." They said their goodbyes to the remaining guests, enduring knowing looks from some of the older ladies and a particularly venomous glare from Eleanor Pritchard. Then they stepped out into the night, now cooler than before, with a gentle breeze that rustled the new leaves on the trees. Nathan offered his arm again, and Violet took it, grateful for the support as they navigated the rutted dirt road that led from the barn back to town. The moon was high and full, casting enough light that they could see their way clearly. "I want to thank you again," Violet said after they'd walked in comfortable silence for a while. "For earlier. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." "I'm glad I was," Nathan replied simply. Then, after a pause, he added, "I noticed you the moment you walked in, you know." Violet glanced up at him, surprised. "You did?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You stood out. Not just because of the black dress, though. That was part of it. There was something about the way you held yourself, like you were carrying the weight of the world, but determined not to let it crush you." His perception startled her. Most people saw only what they expected to see: a grieving widow, fragile and broken. Nathan had seen her strength even when she herself had doubted it. "My husband Robert died of typhoid fever last spring," Violet said, the words coming easier than they ever had before. "He was a good man, kind, hard-working. We were only married 3 years." Nathan listened silently, his steady presence encouraging her to continue. "After he died, it was like the world lost all its color," she admitted. "I went through the motions, kept the house, tended my garden, went to church on Sundays, but none of it seemed real. Or maybe it was too real, and I couldn't bear it." She shook her head, frustrated by her inability to articulate the complexity of grief. "Does that make any sense?" "Perfect sense," Nathan assured her. "After my brother died, I couldn't stay in one place for more than a few weeks. Kept moving, as if I could outrun the pain. Took almost 2 years before I could hear his name without feeling like I'd been kicked in the chest." They had reached the edge of town now, where the buildings grew sparser and the spaces between them wider. Violet's house was visible in the distance, a small, neat structure with a front porch and a garden that was just beginning to show signs of life after the winter. "That's my place," she said, pointing. They walked the remaining distance in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached her gate, Violet turned to face Nathan, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked impulsively, then immediately felt her cheeks flush at the boldness of the invitation. Nathan's expression softened. "I'd like nothing more, Miss Violet, but I think we both know that wouldn't be wise, not tonight." He took her hand gently. "But I'd be honored if you'd allow me to call on you properly. Perhaps Sunday, after church?" Relief and disappointment mingled in Violet's chest. He was right, of course. The town gossips would have a field day if Nathan Yates was seen entering the widow Lawson's house at this hour, no matter how innocent the invitation. Sunday would be lovely, she agreed. Nathan smiled. Then, still holding her hand, he raised it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Violet," he said softly, "and for the smile. It was worth waiting for." With that, he released her hand, tipped his hat, and turned to go. Violet watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually blending with the shadows until she could no longer see him. Only then did she realize she was smiling again. Sunday couldn't come soon enough for Violet. She spent Saturday cleaning her already immaculate house, baking fresh bread, and tending to her garden with renewed vigor. For the first time in months, she found herself humming as she worked, old tunes from her childhood that had lain dormant in her memory. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Violet stood before her wardrobe considering her options. She had worn nothing but black for a year, as custom dictated, but today marked the official end of her mourning period. After some hesitation, she selected a dress of deep purple, not quite returning to bright colors, but a step away from unrelenting black. The church service passed in a blur. Violet was acutely aware of Nathan sitting several pews behind her with the other hands from the Triple R. She could feel his gaze on her back, and it took all her self-control not to turn and look at him. As the congregation filed out after the service, Violet found herself surrounded by the usual well-wishers and gossips, all of whom seemed to have noticed her change of attire and her interaction with Nathan at the barn social. "Purple becomes you, dear," Mrs. Abernathy said approvingly. "And I couldn't help but notice you've caught the eye of that handsome new ranch hand," Nathan Yates, isn't it? He was kind enough to assist me when I felt faint at the social, Violet explained, trying to keep her tone neutral. Nothing more. Of course, dear, Mrs. Abernathy replied with a knowing smile that suggested she didn't believe a word of it. Though I must say, it's high time you started living again. Robert would want that for you. Before Violet could respond, she felt a presence at her shoulder and turned to find Nathan standing there, hat in hand. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt and his best denim trousers. Miss Violet, he greeted her with a tip of his head. Mrs. Abernathy. Mr. Yates, the older woman replied, her eyes twinkling. I was just telling Violet how nice it is to see her getting out and about again. It certainly is, Nathan agreed, his eyes never leaving Violet's face. Miss Violet, I was wondering if I might escort you home. Mrs. Abernathy beamed as if this confirmed all her suspicions. Don't let me keep you young people, she said, already backing away. Such a lovely day for a walk. As she bustled off to join her husband, Violet couldn't help but laugh softly. I'm afraid we're going to be the talk of the town by supper time. Nathan grinned, offering his arm. Would that be so terrible? As they walked through town toward Violet's house, they drew curious glances and a few outright stares. Violet found she didn't mind as much as she might have expected. There was something comforting about Nathan's solid presence beside her, his steady stride matching hers, his occasional comments about the fine weather or a particularly beautiful garden they passed. How long have you lived in Sweetwater Creek? He asked as they turned onto the quieter street that led to her home. All my life, Violet replied. My father was the town doctor until he passed 5 years ago. My mother went to live with my sister in Denver after that, but I stayed. I met Robert not long after he'd come to work as a clerk in the general store. The memories were bittersweet, but not as painful as they once had been. What about you? How did you end up at the Triple R? Luck mostly, Nathan admitted. I was passing through on my way to California, stopped for a drink at the saloon, and overheard Mr. Rickman complaining about being short-handed. I've always had a way with horses, so I offered my services. He shrugged. Been there 3 months now. Mr. Rickman seems satisfied with my work. From what I hear, he more than satisfied, Violet said. Mrs. Rickman told me at church last week that her husband says you're the best horse trainer he's ever employed. Nathan looked pleased but embarrassed by the praise. Just doing what I know how to do. They reached Violet's gate, and this time, when she invited him in for coffee, he accepted with a smile. The house was small but well kept, with simple, sturdy furniture and touches of femininity in the embroidered cushions and curtains. A vase of fresh wildflowers sat on the kitchen table, their bright colors a cheerful note in the otherwise modest room. It's not much, Violet said, suddenly self-conscious as she set about preparing the coffee. But it's home. It's lovely, Nathan said sincerely, looking around with genuine interest. You can tell a lot about a person from their home. Yours is neat, welcoming, speaks of someone who cares about the details. Violet felt herself blush at the compliment. Please sit down. The coffee will be ready shortly. Nathan took a seat at the kitchen table, placing his hat on an empty chair. As Violet busied herself with cups and saucers, she was aware of his eyes following her movements, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of quiet appreciation. Do you enjoy working at the Triple R? She asked, setting the pot on the stove to boil. I do, Nathan replied. It's good, honest work. The men are decent, and Mr. Rickman is fair. Pays on time, which isn't always a given in this line of work. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I've been thinking of settling here permanently, maybe saving up for a small spread of my own someday. The idea of Nathan putting down roots in Sweetwater Creek sent an unexpected thrill through Violet. Land is reasonably priced around here, she said, trying to keep her tone casual, especially if you're willing to take on something that needs work. The coffee began to boil, and Violet poured it into the cups, adding a spoonful of sugar to each as Nathan had requested. She brought them to the table, along with a plate of the fresh bread she'd baked the day before, sliced and spread with butter, and her homemade strawberry preserves. This looks wonderful, Nathan said. taking a piece of bread. "Thank you." They talked easily as they enjoyed their simple meal, discovering shared interests and differences of opinion that led to lively but good-natured debates. Nathan, it turned out, was well-read despite his itinerant lifestyle, having carried books with him on his travels. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father," he explained. "She made sure all her sons had an education, even if it was mostly at the kitchen table rather than in a proper schoolhouse." "How many brothers do you have?" Violet asked, curious about his family. "Had 3, now 2, Nathan said, a shadow passing over his face briefly. "James was the oldest, then me, then Michael and Thomas. Michael was the one we lost to the Sioux." "I'm sorry," Violet said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. Nathan nodded, accepting her sympathy with a small smile. "What about you? You mentioned a sister in Denver?" "Yes, Margaret. She's 3 years older, married with 2 children now." Violet's expression softened as she thought of her niece and nephew. "I try to visit when I can, but it's not always easy to get away." The conversation flowed from family to childhood memories, to books they'd read, and places they'd seen, or, in Violet's case, places she hoped to see someday. The afternoon slipped away, the light changing as the sun began its westward descent. "I should probably go," Nathan said reluctantly, noticing the lengthening shadows. "I've taken up your entire day." "I've enjoyed it," Violet assured him, surprised to realize how much she meant it. For the first time in a long while, she had lost track of time in conversation, without the heavy weight of grief pressing down on her every thought. Nathan stood, reaching for his hat. "Could I call on you again? Perhaps Tuesday evening? I have that day off. And I thought perhaps we could have dinner at the hotel restaurant if you'd be agreeable." The prospect of dining in public with Nathan, essentially announcing to the entire town that she was being courted, made Violet both nervous and excited. It was a significant step, one that would undoubtedly fuel the gossip mill for weeks. "I'd like that," she said finally, making up her mind. "What time shall I expect you?" 6 o'clock, Nathan suggested. "That should give us plenty of time to enjoy our meal before it gets too late." 6 it is, Violet agreed, walking him to the door. At the threshold, Nathan paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and she was surprised to find herself hoping he would. Instead, he took her hand and pressed it gently. "Thank you for today, Violet," he said softly, using her first name without the miss for the first time. "I haven't enjoyed myself so much in a very long time." "Neither have I," she admitted, equally soft. With a final smile, Nathan released her hand and stepped outside. Violet watched from the doorway as he walked down the path to the gate, turned once to wave, and then continued on his way toward the Triple R Ranch. Closing the door, Violet leaned against it, her heart full of emotions she hadn't felt in over a year: hope, anticipation, and the first flickering sparks of something that might, with time, grow into love. Tuesday evening arrived, bringing with it a touch of nervousness as Violet prepared for her dinner with Nathan. She chose a dress of soft blue that she knew brought out the color of her eyes, arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style, and even added a touch of rosewater behind her ears, a small luxury she hadn't indulged in since Robert's death. At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. Violet took a deep breath, checked her appearance one last time in the small mirror by the entryway, and opened the door. Nathan stood on her porch, looking handsome in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his best trousers. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and in his hands he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Good evening, Violet," he said, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "You look quite handsome yourself." He held out the flowers with a slightly sheepish smile. "These aren't much compared to what you could grow in your own garden, but I saw them on my way and thought of you." Touched by the gesture, Violet accepted the bouquet. "They're lovely. Please come in while I put them in water." As she arranged the flowers in a small vase, Violet was aware of Nathan watching her, his gaze a tangible warmth on her skin. There was something both comforting and exhilarating about his presence, a combination she hadn't experienced before. "Ready?" he asked when she'd finished. Violet nodded, reaching for her shawl. Nathan stepped forward to help her drape it around her shoulders, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. The simple touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. The walk to the hotel was pleasant, the spring evening cool but not cold, the air fragrant with blooming flowers and the earthy scent of new growth. They talked easily, picking up their conversation from Sunday as if there had been no interruption. The Sweetwater Creek Hotel was the finest establishment in town, boasting a restaurant that served sophisticated cuisine for the discerning palate, according to the sign outside. In reality, it was a step above the offerings at the saloon, but several steps below the fine dining one might find in Denver or San Francisco. Still, for Sweetwater Creek, it was the height of elegance. The maitre d' showed them to a table near the window, where they could see the town square and the last rays of the setting sun painting the buildings in gold and amber. A few heads turned as they passed, and Violet caught sight of Eleanor Pritchard dining with her father, her expression souring as she noticed them. "I think we've been spotted," Nathan murmured, following Violet's gaze. "It was inevitable," Violet replied with a small shrug. "In a town this size, there are no secrets." Once they were seated and had ordered roast beef for Nathan, chicken for Violet, a slightly awkward silence fell between them. It was different somehow being together in this public setting where their every interaction was subject to scrutiny and interpretation. "I've been thinking about what you said," Nathan said finally, breaking the silence. "About land around here being reasonably priced." Violet looked up, interested. "Oh?" He nodded, absently turning his water glass in a slow circle. "There's a property about 5 miles east of town, nothing grand, 100 acres, small cabin, needs work. But the land is good, with a creek running through it and enough flat ground for decent grazing." He met her eyes. "I rode out to look at it yesterday. The owner's asking price is fair, and I've been saving for years. I could make a down payment, work the land while still earning wages at the R until it starts to turn a profit." The seriousness with which he spoke told Violet this wasn't a casual consideration. "You're really thinking of staying," she said softly. "I am." His gaze held hers steadily. "For the first time in a long while, I've found a place that feels like it could be home. And," he hesitated, then continued, "people worth staying for." The implication was clear, and Violet felt her heart skip a beat. This was moving faster than she had anticipated, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Nathan, the ease she felt in his company, the way her spirits lifted when he was near. "I think that's wonderful," she said sincerely. "Sweetwater Creek is a good place to put down roots." Their food arrived, temporarily shifting the conversation to lighter topics. As they ate, Violet found herself studying Nathan, noticing the strength in his hands as he cut his meat, the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his hazel eyes, the curve of his mouth when he smiled. There was a solidness to him, a dependability that reminded her of Robert in some ways, yet he was entirely his own person, more adventurous perhaps, with a quiet confidence born of having made his own way in the world. After dinner, they lingered over coffee and a shared slice of apple pie, talking about everything and nothing. Nathan told her about his travels, painting vivid pictures of the places he'd seen: the vast open plains of Kansas, the rugged mountains of Montana, the strange, otherworldly landscapes of the desert Southwest. Violet, in turn, shared stories of her childhood in Sweetwater Creek, of helping her father with his patients, of the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher before life had led her in a different direction. "It's not too late, you know," Nathan said when she mentioned her abandoned ambition. "The town's growing. They might need another teacher soon." The thought had never occurred to Violet. After marrying Robert, she'd set aside her own aspirations to support his career at the general store, expecting that they would start a family and her life would follow the traditional path of wife and mother. His death had left her adrift, focused solely on survival and getting through each day. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "though I'd need to refresh my education first. It's been a long time since my schoolgirl days. I have some books you might find useful, Nathan offered. Mathematics, literature, history. Nothing too advanced, but a good start. The idea took root in Violet's mind, a tiny seed of possibility. I'd like that, she said, feeling a spark of the old ambition flicker to life inside her. By the time they left the restaurant, night had fallen completely. The stars were out in force, diamonds scattered across the velvet blackness of the sky. The town was quiet. Most of its inhabitants already retired for the evening. "May I walk you home?" Nathan asked, offering his arm. Violet took it with a smile. "I'd like that." They strolled slowly, neither seeming in a hurry to end the evening. As they passed the town square, the strains of a piano drifted from the saloon, a melancholy tune that suited the peaceful night. "Dance with me?" Nathan asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the deserted square. Violet looked around, surprised. "Here? Now? Why not?" His eyes twinkled with mischief. "The music's good, the night's beautiful, and so is the company." Before she could protest further, he had taken her in his arms, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and begun to guide her in a slow waltz across the packed dirt of the square. Violet laughed, the sound surprising her with its freedom and joy. "People will think we've lost our minds if they see us," she said, but she made no move to stop. "Let them," Nathan replied, spinning her gently. "Sometimes the best moments come from doing the unexpected." They danced until the song ended, then stood for a moment, still in each other's arms, their faces close enough that Violet could feel Nathan's breath on her cheek. Her heart was pounding, and not just from the exertion of the dance. "Violet," Nathan said softly, his voice husky. "Yes?" she whispered, already knowing what was coming, already knowing she wouldn't stop it. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Nathan lowered his head until his lips met hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief, chaste even, but it sent a current of electricity through Violet that left her breathless. When they parted, Nathan searched her face anxiously. "I'm sorry if that was too forward." "It wasn't," Violet assured him, surprised by her own boldness. "I'm not sorry at all." Relief and delight spread across Nathan's features. He took her hand, bringing it to his lips for a kiss that was almost as affecting as the one they'd just shared. "We should continue to your home before I forget myself entirely," he said, his voice still rough with emotion. The rest of the walk passed in a kind of dream for Violet, her mind replaying the kiss, her hand warm in Nathan's. When they reached her gate, she turned to face him, suddenly shy again. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," she said. "The pleasure was all mine," he replied. "May I call on you again soon?" "I'd like that very much." This time, when he bent to kiss her, there was less hesitation, more certainty. His lips were warm and firm against hers, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. Violet found herself responding with a passion she'd thought long buried, her hands resting lightly on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. When they finally parted, they were both breathing a little faster. Nathan pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, his eyes closed as if memorizing the sensation. "Good night, Violet," he said at last, reluctantly stepping back. "Good night, Nathan," she replied, equally reluctant to see him go. She watched until he disappeared into the darkness, then went inside, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, and her heart felt full to bursting with emotions she had thought forever lost to her. For the first time since Robert's death, Violet went to bed with hope for the future, rather than just memories of the past. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of courtship. Nathan called on Violet regularly, sometimes for dinner at her home or at the hotel, sometimes for picnics by the creek or walks through the countryside around Sweetwater Creek. They attended church together on Sundays, shared books and discussed them at length, and gradually, the tentative beginnings of their relationship blossomed into something deeper and more substantial. The town, predictably, buzzed with gossip. Some, like Mrs. Abernathy, were supportive, declaring it high time Violet found happiness again. Others, like Eleanor Pritchard and her circle, were less charitable, suggesting that Violet had moved on indecently quickly and questioning Nathan's intentions. Violet found, to her surprise, that she cared less about the opinions of others than she ever had before. Nathan's steady presence in her life had given her a newfound confidence, a sense that she was entitled to pursue happiness wherever she found it. On a warm day in late June, nearly 2 months after the barn social where they'd first met, Nathan arrived at Violet's door with a picnic basket and a gleam of excitement in his eyes. "I have something to show you," he said, offering no further explanation. Intrigued, Violet fetched her hat and gloves and allowed him to help her up into the wagon he'd borrowed from the Triple R. They headed east out of town, following the main road for a few miles before turning onto a rutted trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. "Where are we going?" Violet asked, curious. "You'll see," Nathan replied with a mysterious smile. After about 20 minutes, they crested a small hill, and Nathan pulled the horses to a halt. Below them lay a valley, lush with summer growth, a silver ribbon of creek winding through its center. On a rise near the creek stood a small cabin, its logs weathered by years of sun and snow, a thin wisp of smoke rising from its stone chimney. "The property I told you about," Nathan explained, watching her reaction closely. "I bought it last week." Violet turned to him in surprise. "You did? Nathan, that's wonderful." His smile broadened at her enthusiasm. "I thought we could have our picnic there, if you'd like to see it up close." "I'd love to," Violet said sincerely. They continued down the hill, the wagon bouncing over the uneven ground. As they drew closer, Violet could see that the cabin, while simple, was solidly built. A small corral had been added to one side, currently empty, and there was evidence of recent work: freshly cut wood stacked beside the door, a new leather hinge on the shutters, repairs to the porch steps. "It's not much," Nathan said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's a start. The previous owner left some furniture, and I've been coming out here on my days off to make repairs." He led her inside, where a single large room served as kitchen, dining room, and living area. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, a rough-hewn table and chairs in another. A curtain partitioned off what Violet assumed was the sleeping area. The floor was swept clean, and wildflowers, similar to the ones Nathan had brought her on their first dinner date, stood in a jar on the table. "You've been busy," Violet remarked, touched by the evidence of his efforts. "There's still much to do," Nathan admitted, running a hand along the edge of the table. "The roof needs work before winter, and I'd like to add another room eventually. But it's sound, and the land is good." They took their picnic outside, spreading a blanket near the creek where they could enjoy the view of the valley. As they ate the simple meal of cold chicken, bread, cheese, and early summer berries, Nathan outlined his plans for the property where he would graze cattle, which areas he would cultivate for crops, improvements he wanted to make to the cabin. "It sounds like you've thought of everything," Violet said, impressed by his foresight and planning. "Almost everything," Nathan replied, his tone suddenly serious. He set aside his plate and turned to face her fully. "Violet, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart began to race as she realized what might be coming. "Yes?" Nathan took her hands in his expression earnest and slightly nervous. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I understand if you think this is too soon. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I love you, Violet. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you at that barn social, looking so brave and so vulnerable all at once. These past weeks have only confirmed what I already knew, that you're the woman I want to spend my life with." Tears sprang to Violet's eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy. "Oh, Nathan. I'm not asking you to forget Robert," he continued quickly. "I know he'll always have a place in your heart, and I respect that. But I'm hoping there might be room for me too." He squeezed her hands gently. "Violet Lawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Violet couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. The proposal wasn't entirely unexpected. They had been moving in this direction for weeks, but hearing the words, seeing the love and hope in Nathan's eyes, was more affecting than she had anticipated. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Nathan, I'll marry you." The smile that lit up his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. Violet returned the kiss with equal fervor, her heart so full it felt it might burst. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Nathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I have something for you," he said, tipping its contents into his palm. A ring gleamed there, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire that matched the blue of her dress. "It's beautiful," Violet breathed as he slipped it onto her finger. "How did you know my size?" Nathan looked slightly embarrassed. "I may have borrowed one of your rings from your jewelry box when you were making coffee last Sunday," he admitted. "I hope you don't mind." Violet laughed, too happy to be upset by his subterfuge. "I don't mind at all." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property, hand in hand, making plans for their future together. Nathan showed her where he thought they might plant a garden larger than the one she had in town. They discussed how they would furnish the cabin, what improvements were priorities, and, tentatively, where children might sleep when the time came. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, they reluctantly packed up the remains of their picnic and prepared to return to town. "When shall we tell people?" Violet asked as Nathan helped her back into the wagon. "Whenever you'd like," he replied, "though I suspect Mrs. Abernathy will notice that ring the moment we get back to town, and the news will spread faster than wildfire." Violet laughed, knowing he was right. "Then let's tell her first, officially. She's been kind to me, and I think she'll be genuinely happy for us." The ride back to town was filled with discussion of wedding plans. They agreed on a small ceremony, perhaps in the town church with just a few close friends in attendance. As for timing, they decided on August, giving them just over a month to prepare. It was a short engagement by conventional standards, but neither saw any reason to wait. As predicted, Mrs. Abernathy spotted the ring almost immediately when they stopped by the post office where she was collecting her mail. Her delighted exclamations brought several other curious townsfolk running, and soon they were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations. Even Eleanor Pritchard, when they encountered her on the way to Violet's house, managed a tight smile and a murmured, "Best wishes," though her eyes told a different story as they lingered on Nathan. That evening, as they sat on Violet's porch watching the first stars appear, Nathan put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Happy?" he asked softly. Violet leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand with its new ring resting on his chest. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she admitted. "When Robert died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I never imagined I could find love again, especially not so soon." Nathan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I sometimes think our losses prepare us to recognize happiness when it comes again," he said thoughtfully. "Before Michael died, I took so much for granted. Now, I know how precious each day is, each moment with someone you love." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the town, distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional whinny of a horse, the soft murmur of voices from neighboring porches where other couples or families enjoyed the cool evening air. "I should go," Nathan said eventually, though he made no move to release her. "It's getting late, and I have an early start tomorrow." Violet nodded reluctantly. As a concession to propriety, they had maintained separate residences despite their engagement, with Nathan staying in the bunkhouse at the Triple R until their wedding. It was the proper thing to do, especially in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but that didn't make their nightly partings any easier. "Just a few more weeks," she reminded him, and herself. "Then we won't have to say goodnight like this anymore." Nathan's arm tightened around her. "A few weeks feels like an eternity," he murmured, then kissed her softly. "But you're worth waiting for, Violet Lawson." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Violet, with the help of Mrs. Abernathy and a few other friendly women from town, worked on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Nathan continued his improvements to the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and expanding the main living area to create a more comfortable home for his bride. On the morning of their wedding day, August 15, 1875, Violet awoke to perfect blue skies and a sense of peaceful certainty. There were no last-minute doubts, no second thoughts about the step she was about to take. She loved Nathan Yates with all her heart, and she was ready to begin their life together. Mrs. Abernathy arrived early to help her dress and arrange her hair, bringing with her a bouquet of wildflowers similar to those Nathan had given her on their first dinner date. "Something old," she announced, pinning a cameo brooch that had belonged to Violet's mother to the collar of her dress. "Something new," she continued, presenting a pair of delicate lace gloves. "Something borrowed," she added, fastening a pearl necklace around Violet's neck. "And something blue," she finished, tucking a blue ribbon into Violet's hair. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "You're a vision, my dear. That young man of yours won't know what hit him." The ceremony was simple but moving. The small church was decorated with more wildflowers and ribbons, and filled with the friends who had supported Violet through her darkest days, and now came to celebrate her joy. Nathan, handsome in a new suit, waited for her at the altar, his face lighting up with love and wonder as she walked toward him on the arm of Mr. Abernathy, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of her father. Their vows were traditional, but spoken with such sincerity that many in the congregation found themselves wiping away tears. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan's kiss was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The reception was held at the hotel, where the dining room had been cleared for dancing and tables laden with food prepared by the townsfolk in a community effort to celebrate the new couple. There was laughter, music, dancing, and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows, Nathan found Violet in conversation with Mrs. Rickman, his employer's wife. "May I steal my wife for a moment?" he asked with a smile that still sent Violet's heart racing. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Rickman replied with an indulgent wave. "You two go on now." Nathan led Violet out onto the hotel's small balcony, where they could have a moment of privacy amidst the celebration. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. The new name sent a thrill through Violet. "Completely, Mr. Yates," she replied, leaning into his embrace, "though I think I might be even happier once we're alone." Nathan's eyes darkened at her words, and he bent to kiss her. A kiss that held the promise of the night to come. "Then perhaps it's time we made our farewells," he suggested, his voice husky. They slipped back inside to thank their guests and receive final congratulations before departing for their new home. Nathan had borrowed Mr. Rickman's best buggy for the occasion, decorated with ribbons and flowers by some of the younger girls in town who thought it terribly romantic. As they drove through town and then out onto the open road that would take them to their homestead, Violet leaned against Nathan's shoulder, a sense of contentment washing over her. The golden light of sunset gave way to the silver glow of moonrise, illuminating the familiar landscape with an almost magical radiance. "Look," Nathan said suddenly, pointing ahead. As they crested the hill that overlooked their valley, they could see the cabin below, windows glowing with warm light. "I asked one of the hands to ride ahead and light the lamps for us." It was a thoughtful gesture, one of many that had endeared Nathan to Violet over the course of their courtship. The sight of their home, waiting to welcome them, brought tears to her eyes. "Our home," she said softly. Nathan's arm tightened around her. "Our home," he echoed, "the first day of our life together." When they reached the cabin, Nathan surprised her by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold, a tradition he insisted on observing despite her laughing protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. Inside, she found more evidence of his thoughtfulness. The table was set for a simple supper with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. A fire burned in the hearth, taking the chill off the evening air. And there were flowers everywhere, not just wildflowers this time, but proper bouquets that must have been brought from town earlier in the day. "When did you arrange all this?" Violet asked, touched by his efforts. "I had help," Nathan admitted with a smile. "Some of the boys from the Triple R rode out this morning. They may tease me mercilessly about being lovesick, but they're good friends. After a light supper and a glass of wine, they sat together before the fire, content for the moment just to be in each other's company, to know that they had the rest of their lives ahead of them. When Nathan finally stood and offered his hand to help her up, there was a question in his eyes, a mixture of desire and consideration for her feelings. Violet took his hand without hesitation, her heart full of love for this man who had brought light back into her life when she thought she would live forever in shadow. As he led her to their bedroom, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home, not just in this cabin or in Sweetwater Creek, but in Nathan's arms. In the years that followed, their love only deepened. The small homestead prospered under their joint care, expanding to include more land, more cattle, and eventually more buildings as their family grew. Violet did indeed become a teacher, first to their own children, and later, when Sweetwater Creek's population warranted a second school, to the children of the town that had supported her through both tragedy and joy. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children were abed, Nathan would take Violet in his arms and dance with her under the stars, just as they had that night in the town square when he'd first kissed her. And Violet would remember the barn social where it all began, when she grew pale with the weight of her grief, and a kind cowboy took her outside and held her until she smiled.